Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a drama, horror, and mystery film called The Beach House. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. In hopes of fixing their strained relationship, Randall, a college dropout, and Emily, a third-year organic chemistry student, go on vacation at a beach house that Randall's father owns. Upon their arrival, they notice that the neighborhood looks abandoned. Randall explains that more people arrive around Memorial Day, but they have the whole place to themselves until then. Randall and Emily then decide to go into their room to express their longing for each other before settling in. Once Emily gets dressed, Randall tells her that he wants to live there with her. He says the house is just sitting empty, adding that it's such a waste. However, Emily is worried about her grad school. Randall then asks if it can't wait, telling his girlfriend to think about it and not be scared. But Emily doesn't respond and just leaves. After a while, Emily explores the house and finds a medicine cabinet for one Jane Turner and a fully stocked fridge, indicating that people are currently occupying the place. While Emily is investigating around, a woman suddenly enters the house. So Emily quickly hides, and seconds later, she sees the woman at the table. Confused, Emily quietly rushes back to their room to alert her sleeping boyfriend. Randall says that's impossible, adding that no one should be in the house, but Emily just orders him to get dressed. Moments later, Randall and Emily meet Jane and Mitch Turner, who are close friends with Randall's father. Emily apologizes to Jane and Mitch, saying they don't want to ruin their weekend. Emily also says they can move to a hotel, but Mitch dismisses the idea. The couple then invites Emily and Randall to continue their stay despite the surprise, stating that the house is big enough for all of them. Emily clearly feels uncomfortable staying with Jane and Mitch, but Randall ignores her and accepts their invitation. A bit annoyed, Emily excuses herself, saying she'll just get their bags from the car. Emily smokes as she sits outside, looking at an unknown organism on the ground. Randall then follows her, and Emily makes it clear that she's unhappy with their situation. However, Randall says it's not his fault that his father let his friends come to the beach house. Unfortunately, his comment immediately irritates Emily. The purpose of their vacation is to straighten things out between them, but with other people around, Emily feels that they can't do that. Feeling emotional, Emily brings up how Randall suddenly dropped out of school and left her without saying a word. Because of that, Randall apologizes to Emily and admits that he made mistakes, saying they'll figure things out. Randall then promises that everything will be fine, also reminding Emily that he loves her. That night, the four occupants enjoyed dinner while exchanging stories, with Mitch sharing how Randall wouldn't eat anything they made when he was a boy. Emily also teases Randall to eat an oyster for old time's sake, and upon doing so, he suddenly remembers why he didn't like it in the first place. Meanwhile, Jane asks Emily what she's studying at school. Emily then replies that she's studying organic chemistry, making Mitch say it's an ambitious major. So, Emily admits that she did it as a bit of a challenge to herself, adding that she wants to study astrobiology at the University of Washington. Once Emily is done talking about her studies, Jane also asks Randall about his major. Randall then replies that he's currently not in school, adding that he's had enough of it. Mitch wonders how Randall's father reacted to that, but unlike Emily, Randall believes that everything he learned from school won't really help him in life. Mitch and Jane listen as Randall talks about how pointless education is, but they don't really judge him. However, Jane tells Randall that he should be thankful that he has enough time to do whatever he wants. After the serious conversation, Randall offers to get more drinks for them. Unfortunately, there's no more wine, so Randall suggests they take edibles instead. Emily thinks it's inappropriate, but Randall just ignores her. Emily is also worried because Jane is medicated, but Randall is sure they'll be fine. Although apprehensive at first, Mitch, Jane, and Emily eventually agree. After eating the edibles, Jane and Emily continue talking about organic chemistry. They then go out on the porch and see the surroundings covered with blue luminous spore-like organisms. Mitch asks Randall if he's seen those before, but Randall says no. Emily states that they're windswept microbes of some kind, which are usually in the water. In awe of the beautiful surroundings, Jane asks Mitch to let her explore the area to get a closer look, and her husband allows her. On the other hand, Emily starts smoking, making Mitch comment that she should know better. A bit embarrassed, Emily admits that Randall hates it too. Meanwhile, Randall asks Jane if she's okay as she puts on her shoes, so she assures him that she's just having so much fun. She then goes out and touches a tree, and then she starts coughing before calling Mitch for help. At the same time, a pungent odor disturbs Emily, followed by a heavy fog covering the area. Feeling slightly lightheaded and concerned for his wife's safety, Mitch goes out looking for Jane. On the other hand, Emily and Randall decide to stay in the house and wait for the couple to return. However, Emily starts to feel lightheaded and passes out in the living room while looking around. Waking up in the middle of the night, Emily hears Jane throwing up in the bathroom. She attempts to check if she's alright, but is stopped by Mitch closing the bathroom door. With nothing else to do, Emily returns to their room with Randall and goes to bed despite feeling unwell. The next day, Emily and Randall decide to go down to the beach since the fog is already dissipated. Before leaving their room, Emily tells Randall that she saw Jane throwing up the previous night. Randall admits that he didn't think they'd get so messed up, adding that he thought they'd enjoy it, but there's nothing they can do about it now. Then, just as they're about to exit the house, Emily sees Jane at the table with lesions on her skin and acting strangely. She won't answer Emily's questions and only moves when Emily mentions Mitch, slowly making her way to their room. Worried, Randall and Emily look for Mitch at the beach, but they fail to find him. Randall wonders why he would leave Jane without a word, so Emily tells him that he's probably somewhere close. Since it's hot outside, they just lie down on the sand and rest there. Later on, Randall suddenly wakes up with an upset stomach and hurries back to the house to use the bathroom, leaving Emily alone. Unfortunately, he leaves the car keys in his shoe beside Emily in his haste. While in the bathroom, Randall notices how dirty the water is in the sink. Then, when he goes out, he hears some noise from upstairs, so he checks on Jane. Meanwhile, Emily awakes to Mitch sitting next to her, and he also seems to be acting strangely. Mitch starts explaining that he and Jane went to the beach house so that he could give her one last moment of happiness. But despite being with each other for years, their relationship changed due to her illness. Emily quietly listens as Mitch talks about Jane, not even daring to interrupt him. Then, Emily asks how Jane is once Mitch is done talking, but he just smiles and changes the subject. Moments later, Mitch decides to swim but does not come up for air, so Emily tries to go after him. Unfortunately, she steps on an infected jellyfish and quickly falls down. Then, as she slowly sits up to inspect her foot, she sees a worm inside her open wound. Observing her surroundings, Emily finds the shore littered with infected jellyfish. So, to avoid further damage to her foot, she crawls back to the house to disinfect it. Upon reaching the kitchen, Emily disinfects the wound by pouring vinegar on it and gently pulling out the parasite with a pair of thongs. Afterward, she goes up to the bathroom and bandages her foot before going to their room to change her clothes. Then, as she gets dressed, she spots Randall as he drags his body away from the other room and tries to help him, and he hurriedly goes downstairs after noticing something behind him. Emily then looks back and sees Jane crawling towards them with her eyes glazed white and mouth foaming. Terrified, Emily quickly helps Randall out of the house, making sure to wrap a discarded hose on the door handle to prevent it from opening. Unable to drive without their car keys, Randall and Emily try to find help around the neighborhood, only to see one of the neighbors in the same condition as Jane. Soon, darkness falls and the heavy fog starts covering the area again. Walking around, they eventually stumble upon an abandoned police car. Emily uses the radio to call for help, and the stranger who responds instructs them to stay indoors with sealed doors and windows and prevent themselves from inhaling the air around them, saying that it is not fog. Heeding the stranger's warning, they break into a nearby house. Turning on the television and radio, they hear a broadcast saying that the air components are ancient microbes preserved in rocks under the ocean and released due to the increasing heat on the Earth's surface. Randall states that he may not make it and expresses how scared he is, so Emily reassures him that it's okay and tells him to try and hold on. After a while, Emily goes to seal the house and search for anything useful. Eventually, she finds diving equipment in the basement, complete with oxygen tanks and a snorkel, and she takes up the tanks one by one. In the living room, Randall continues to listen to the broadcast, and according to the person speaking, what's currently happening will cause an extinction event to all complex forms of life. Then, suddenly, he throws up a mutated form of the shellfish he ate the night before. Meanwhile, Emily is starting to bring up the last oxygen tank, but a sound behind her stops her. As she investigates, she sees a humanoid hunched over a person who has passed away due to the infection. Aghast, she rushes to bring the oxygen tank upstairs, only to find Randall in the same state as Jane, his eyes glazed white and mouth foaming. Heartbroken to see the man she loves succumbing to the infection, Emily knocks Randall out with the oxygen tank, not willing to fall victim to it herself and to know that there is no hope for him. Trying to come to terms with the fact that she is now alone, Emily finds a set of car keys under the TV stand. She goes to the car along with the oxygen tanks, making sure to turn off the air conditioner to ensure the outside air does not enter the vehicle. Afterward, Emily drives blindly through the night while fighting dizziness, but she eventually hits a tree and passes out. Later on, she wakes up and musters the last of her strength to drag her body away from the car, and it isn't long before she passes out on a puddle. The following day, Emily regains consciousness by the shore, seeming to have made her way there. Unfortunately, her eyes are glazed white as she repeatedly tells herself not to be scared before she's washed away by the ocean.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.